Tonight we are going to have a social life talk titled Despair, Resiliency, and Hope, Understanding and Navigating Depression After COVID-19 with our special guest speaker, Dr. James Manganiello. And this talk is hosted by Social Life, the young adult ministry of Cape Cod Church. We try and develop rich community for young adults here on the Cape, and we also periodically host talks like this, carving out space for important and helpful conversations for our community, which we are really grateful to be able to do. And tonight, we are really excited to welcome Dr. James Manganiello. And now, if you're joining us, you probably have figured out by now that this is hosted by Cape Cod Church and at Cape Cod Church. If you're joining us in person, you definitely know that. But we know that many of you joining us are not affiliated with a church or Cape Cod Church in general. And tonight, Dr. Jim is not here to bring us a sermon or a message about faith and mental health. But he is a professional in his field, and we are really excited to learn from him. So no matter who you are or where you've come from this evening, we are excited to come together to learn a little bit more about this topic, which is often misunderstood, so that we can better love and care for people in our lives. Or maybe you're here tonight and you're here because you personally suffer from a mental illness or from depression specifically, and you've come to learn and figure out some potential next steps for yourself. We know that it has been a tough year for our world as well as our specific community. Many of us are feeling the impacts of that, and we wanted to provide a resource for people in that space. So I am very excited to welcome Dr. James Manganiello for this talk, and I have the privilege of introducing him with our little bio here that we have created together. And if you will excuse me, I'm just going to read from that. Dr. James Manganiello has over 40 years of experience providing psychological therapy to multigenerational and multicultural families and individuals. He received his doctorate from Boston University, his master's of public health from Harvard University, and was both clinical psychology intern and clinical research fellow in the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and Mass General Hospital in Boston. Later, his interest brought him to additional studies in psychoanalytic psychotherapy and understanding emotional traumatic stress, earning him the distinction of board-certified expert in traumatic stress. So he is the perfect person to speak to us in the midst of a global pandemic. His mindful focus in psychotherapy is to provide whole person understanding and resolution of internal struggles. He has been given several awards and acknowledgement in his academic field. He might be embarrassed for me to share them, but some of his most recent collaborative published articles include Cultivating Gratitude, Contemplative Discovery Pathway Theory Applied to Group Therapy in the Bahamas, and An Instrument for Assessment of Longitudinal Community Resocialization Through a Group Process Intervention. And if you don't know what that means, that's okay, you're in good company, but we're grateful that there are professionals who do know what that means. Dr. Manganiello also has a wide range of consulting experiences to psychiatric institutes within Massachusetts, the Baltic nations, the Bahamas, and Geneva, Switzerland, including the World Health Organization and United Nations. Needless to say, he is full of good stories. Finally, Dr. Manganiello is a member of and a good friend to Cape Cod Church. Perhaps his most notable accomplishment tonight is his compassion, kindness, and generosity toward others. So with that, will you please help me welcome Dr. Jim Manganiello to the stage?
I was thinking about this talk tonight and looking at what we've been experiencing over the last year plus of moments of despair, coming to terms with our own resiliency, and then the opportunity to kind of have hope. And those continue to cycle throughout the year and a half plus. It was almost as if we looked forward to the vaccine. We look forward to the production of certain elements of treatment. We try to think of all the possibilities that would keep us hopeful to the very end, so that we would know that we would obviously be able to survive. I just want to give you a little handle on how I see people over the course of the last 40 years or so. I developed a simple diagram that helps me think through when someone is sitting with me as to what it is that is influencing the pain, the hurt, the struggle, the concern that they bring. And so if you see this simple diagram, if we can go to the next slide, you will notice that it talks about whole person, dynamic, and interactive. And at the very core, at the bottom, you'll see the word spiritual, underneath that, beliefs. Since I am a Christian, I believe in the basis of creation, of our reconnection with God. And so, if some of you are not of that persuasion, there is a belief that you have about yourself that is critical to the core of your being. And that core is the spiritual dimension, the belief that we have of who we are, our identity, how we progress in life, and what is the core source of strength that we have within us. And if you notice that beyond that little oval circle, you'll see relationships. And I talk about relationships as acquaintances, friends, and relatives. I don't specifically say family because they're included as relatives at that level, because the influences that a child has in early development is obviously from the family, from the siblings. All of the early analysts talked about that. If you have Freud, who talked about a biological development, if you have Jung, who talked about a spiritual persona of an individual, and if you have Adler, talked about the social influences of other siblings on a person's personality. All of those factors make up a critical part of how we interact, because each circle is interactive dynamically, going in both directions. So what we have in relationships will influence our beliefs, and our beliefs will influence our relationships. As those relationships get developed, we think about the emotions that begin to arise around those relationships. They become more formulated, they're more clear, they're more stated, they have more of an authenticity of what's there. For example, my granddaughter, who has just turned 5, was talking with her dad, our son, and saying that, sometimes I get very upset and I want to see what it is that's going on. I'm very, very upset. And so my son said, well, you can talk to Nonno. Nonno is the Italian for grandfather. And said, you can talk to Nonno. Call Dr. Nonno right away. I have to talk to him. Now, there's a wise child. But anyway, we will go beyond that and recognize that even at age 5, as emotions begin to formulate and get framed, they're very critical as to their influence on the individual, both in their relationship within the family, what they feel about themselves inside, and how they can verbalize those emotions. Interestingly enough, she said to me when I finally met up with her, and we met at the house, and she said, no, my feelings are too strong. Now, a 5-year-old, if I weren't sitting put with a cane, I would have fallen over, because a 5-year-old to verbalize that so clearly is very unusual. My feelings are too strong. I want to understand why I have these strong feelings. Of course, at 5 years old, she has been quarantined in a house for 1.5 years. Her parents have miraculously tried to be very creative in homeschooling since she was not going to preschool. They had trips all over the world that they played out with pictures and actions and all these sorts of things, knowing more than I knew about the world, as it were. But she had this grand time, and her brother, who was going to be 2 years old in this coming May, was tagging along. That's all he knew how to do, tag along. Sometimes in life, we feel that someone is leading the charge and we're only tagging along. We don't have the capacity to take charge of ourselves. And as a result of that, we begin to feel more depressed and more reluctant to be engaged with other people. Another piece of this whole person is the body, because obviously when we feel or we have surgery or if we have issues with our body, it immediately communicates to our emotions, to our relationships with those around us, and even to the inner core. If it's a very severe issue, then we know that it will significantly affect our emotions. And above it, you can see that the intellectual capacity is developing now. Emotions somewhat develop before the cognitive piece. Even though Piaget talks about the several stages of cognitive development, the emotional piece is always there because that's what gets trapped in the interactions at a very early age. You know this with a child. If you hold a child who may be 6 or 8 months old, what is their immediate reflex when you put your finger near their hand? They grab it. They know that that is something secure for themselves. That's an emotional feeling of satisfaction, of security, of knowing well-being at that early age. And then beyond that, we have culture, society, groups, and family. And I put family there because family is the ethos that influences each of us. What standards the family has, what ways they are working with each other, how they engage with others around them, how they set certain standards, mores, and certain elements of the family definition of what it's like for you to be in that family. And then beyond that is the environment. The environment also has a great play. I'm not here to sell the Green New Deal, but what I am saying is that the environment is an important part of our being as well. We are influenced. For example, if you're older and you have somewhat of an arthritic condition, and with the condition of today's weather, are you influenced? Do you begin to feel pain? Do you feel more malaise that you can't quite go about your life? And as that occurs, it affects all the way through the intellectual, the body, the emotion, the relationships, and the spiritual. And the first thing that usually one says, I feel very achy today. It just doesn't feel right. It's just something that's there. So when I talk with someone, all of these aspects are interplayed with trying to find out what the individual is struggling with, because all of it is significant. All is important. We can't divorce one from the other. Many times, unfortunately, medicine today is almost taught in a silo effect. If you have this problem, then you go to this specialist. If you have this problem, you go to that specialist. And what you're beginning to find is that your primary care physician is ending up being a distributor to specialists. That's how they make their income. That's how they work. Because the primary care is, oh, okay, you need to see doc so-and-so, you need to see this one. And the reality is that you lose the benefit of value of the integration of the being. We are not isolated, siloed individuals as we operate. We're integrated considerably. If someone talks to me about the pain that they're experiencing and the emotional struggle that they have, I want to know what is behind that emotional struggle. When did it start? How did it start? With whom? In what circumstance? In what situation? What is it that went on? What were the details of that situation? These are critical facts to understand the basis of what it is that's there. If we could go to the next slide. I just want to relate a few definitions. Pandemic, which we're all aware of these days by now. It's been spoken of, I think, on every news item since last January, and more specifically since March of last year. Today, we still hear it. Today, we still have the local channels giving out pandemic information. How many cases? How many were hospitalized? And how many deaths? Those are the three major categories that we see all the time. What strikes me is, what happens to those who recover? We have no indication of how many have recovered from COVID. And yet there have been thousands who have recovered from COVID. We occasionally see a picture of a person being wheeled out of the hospital who recovered COVID after 2-3 months. That's great, all to be praised. But what about the individuals who recover without intervention, who had to stay home and be quarantined, who didn't have the severe symptoms that are so prevalent in this disease and has been reported? COVID-19 was established as a label by the World Health Organization. SARS-CoV-2 is the international committee that has the definition. So the two go together, the exact same virus, only World Health decided to shorten it to COVID-19 because that's when it happened. It was discovered 2019. But it's really a part of the full SARS virus that occurred back a few years ago. And we know that it's a large family of coronaviruses, usually cause mild to moderate upper respiratory tract illnesses. That's where it first hit. It was the first indication that your respiratory system was hit by this COVID disease. And that's why all of the incubators were being made. We need to help people breathe. We need to help them recover from their lungs that have been compromised by COVID. And those individuals who had comorbidity with other illnesses that were there obviously suffered worse with this first round and phase of COVID. But as we began to know, COVID had many other features that were more than just the effect on lungs. It affected the heart. It affected the nervous system. And so it had many other offshoots of effects that we've come to realize that are there and have some effects that are detrimental. For example, Jason Tatum, who plays for the Celtics, you may know, watching him on TV, he had COVID, and his condition was compromised significantly because of his heart. His recovery was much slower because his heart was not able to catch up as quickly as some of the other individuals. Never had heart condition, but that's where the COVID rested. It moved throughout his body and rested in his heart. So he's recovered. He's had to do tremendous amount of reworking of his health condition in order to overcome that. So the initial phase of this COVID was sort of like, well, it's no different than a cold. I think we heard that very early on. Oh, it's no different than the flu, no different than the cold. But in fact, it's very, very suspect to serious illness, and particularly with those who have comorbid conditions. I lost a dear friend who was a former head of school at Lexington Christian Academy in Lexington, Massachusetts, who had been here several years and then moved back south, and then at one point received an email that he had passed because of complications to COVID, because he had other comorbidities that were interfering with his life. Other definitions we want to think about: despair, the complete loss or absence of hope. And I'm sure some of you have felt that at times. Resilience, the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties, ability to spring back into shape, feeling that there's a sense of elasticity in our bodies that are able to get us back to a functioning level. And then hope, a feeling of expectation and desire for a certain thing to happen. Want something to happen positively, not negatively, positively. Now, I'm going to tell you a little story, and you may see various phases of what we have just defined, and you may have experienced the very same thing. Since COVID has occurred, I have been doing all of my sessions by telehealth. Everything is online, and I've been very proud to show my adult children that I do know a little bit about technology, and so I've done everything on my phone. It was fantastic. I finally had this little computer in my hand, and everything was on this phone. It was great. Well, in the middle of a session on a Friday morning at 11:20, I'll never forget it, my phone goes black. Talk about despair. I got out of my little office, opened the door, and ran to seek my wife. I said, "Wife, I have a big problem." We have to make sure we identify each other that way. 55 years married, it makes a big difference. You know, we still have to make sure we know who we are. So here we are, and I said, "I need your phone." I said, "You have Zoom set up on your phone?" "Yes." I said, "Good. Then I'm going to use your phone if you don't mind." "Well, how long are you going to have it?" "Well, I have no idea. My phone went black. The indication is it may have overheated." So I put it outside. Of course, the temperature at the time was in the 30s. So I said, it will cool down pretty quickly. So there it was, outside cooling. And I said, "I just need it for this remaining hour, because we usually take a 2-hour lunch break between 12 and 2, so that way we're able to do other things, get out of the house and do certain other things as well, errands." And I said, "At 12 o'clock, I am going to find a place. I'm going to Best Buy. I'm going to Geek Squad. I'm going to these places to see whether they can get this phone up and running. Everything is in this phone." Right? So, long story short, we fast forward. I go to one store. Not a good sign that it turned black. "Oh, thank you. You think we can get it?" I don't think so. "I know a fellow on Main Street in Hyannis. You ought to go there. He fixes everything." All right, so I had to go back. I said, "I need your phone for a few more hours, and then I'm going to go seek out this fellow on Main Street." I go to Main Street, pull up in front of his store, Cellular Medic. I said, "This guy must know what he's doing." So I go to the door, and there's a little white sign. "I've decided to take this weekend off." Why this weekend? I need this phone. So I rush back to Best Buy. Well, Best Buy, I go to the fella, and he says, "Oh, you have to see the Geek Squad over there again. Just go and stand in line." So I'm standing in line, very, very, I was going to say righteously, but I won't do that. At any rate, I stood in line, and suddenly this salesperson comes over to me. "Sir," I said, "Yes." "Are you waiting for the Geek Squad?" I said, "Yes, I am. My phone went out and I need to get it started as soon as possible." Desperation, obviously. Here we are, total despair. She says, "Oh, did you have an appointment?" Appointment? No one said I needed an appointment. Yeah, you need an appointment. Oh my goodness, follow me over to the computer and we'll see if we can put you in for an appointment. I'm sorry, sir, but the earliest I can do it will be Wednesday afternoon. I said, "Wednesday afternoon? I can't do that. I need this phone." Despair building and building and building. You can see that I did not have much hope about getting this phone back going. However, this fellow on Main Street said he was going to open at noontime on Monday. Great timing. Bolt for the store. Park in front. I go inside. One other customer only. I've lucked out. No waiting, no strips on the sidewalk, no strips in the store, no feet saying 6 feet apart. Just come right in. Oh, great. All right. I go in, he takes a look at it. He said, "I think it's the battery." Now, I have to find a battery. Oh, I don't have a battery. I have to order a battery for it. I mean, do you think that's the real reason why this thing went blank? I think the battery went out. Okay, but you have to pay for the battery up front. Okay, I will do that. I should have this ready by Wednesday. Well, okay, so I'm negotiating with Rosemary, my wife. I need your phone. And by that time, I finally got smart enough and said, I can do Zoom on my computer. What a thought. Okay, so I got my computer out, hooked up Zoom, got it going. And that relieved some of the tension between us of having to share this phone. And then I go back on Wednesday. "I'm sorry, sir. I have had this plugged in for over 3 hours, and I still cannot get any signal that it will start. I'm sorry, your phone has crashed. Your motherboard is gone." Well, you can see I was not a very happy camper at that time, but at least I was able to have some resolution with Zoom on my computer. So I said, well, I've got to buy a new phone. Fast forward, I finally told my adult children the whole scheme of things as it happened, and they said, "Dad, you have to back things up. You know, back up what's on your phone, so that way if anything happens, you can always retrieve it." See, I said, I knew I should never given up the paper and the pencil. That way I would have always had record of what I was doing. He said, "Dad, we're not talking about that. We're talking about the cloud." Oh, I said, "I see many clouds go by, but I have no idea what you're talking about. What about this cloud?" So I had this whole instruction about cloud. So you can see the wave of emotion, despair, how resilient we can become when there's a little bit of hope, and then hope disappears when we no longer have the answer in hand. Well, that was my experience. I'm sure all of you have similar experiences that you can talk about that have gone through. Now, we have a series of categories of depression. Time is not our friend tonight, so I'm not going to go through all of them. But I am going to focus only on two, and that is the situational depression, which are stress response syndrome, and major clinical depression. But you can see there are a number of different types of depression: seasonal affective disorder, SAD, which is quite important to us here in the northern part of the United States, where we have shortened days, less sun, less vitamin D, less sun available to our bodies, and our bodies begin to change and become depressed. Premenstrual dysphoric disorder. Women, you're aware of those issues if you've had those problems. You've had postpartum depression. resistant or persistent depressive disorder, either chronic or dysthymia, and that's where a person has depression but just doesn't quite have the capacity to beat it, if you will, to be able to overcome, to be able to feel finally resolved that this malaise of down and feeling out and feeling overwhelmed and not being able to concentrate and feeling they can't sleep, appetite changes. And those particular depressions, persistent and resistant, have significant evidence. It's not a lost cause, by the way. A persistent depression can be resolved if the right information is given and the right combination of medications and other particular interventions are done. I read an article that was done by Marty Keller, who I was in class with many years ago when I studied at MGH at Harvard. He's a psychiatrist who stayed at Mass General for a while. We were together, actually, at the General Psychiatry practice in the Wang building. And he then went on to Brown, and he did a research study that looked at resistant depressive disorders. And he found that there is a combination medication that works very well, that has just been approved by the FDA, where it can break through some of the barriers of this constant feeling of depression. There's bipolar depression, which you know was originally called in the early days manic depression. Manic depressives usually were thought of more in the manic phase, less on the depressive phase, but both are critically important to understand and to be able to address in order to get relief from that condition. There's also psychotic depression, where there's a total loss of reality. The person is not grounded or based, but only in delusions and hallucinations about what's going on around them, become more paranoid, become more concerned about people going after them, that sort of thing. That's not schizophrenia, it's psychotic depression. And then there are also physical conditions inducing depression. I'll never forget when I was in my first year of training at Mass General, I was called to do a consult on the orthopedic ward because they had a patient who had orthopedic surgery and was not responding well to treatment, was not responding well to staff, and had some significant problems. And so one of my tasks was to do psychological testing of the more critical input, such as Rorschach and all those kinds of fancy things. And when I finished it, I said, you know, there's something going on here. The person is depressed, but he also has a substance abuse. And that's why the treatment is not responding as well. He has not really been totally detoxed when you started surgery. And as a result of that, he is caught in this cycle of his blood system always wanting more and not getting anything. And he's in a cycle of pain and agony and irritability and having to be a very poor patient to manage. That's only one indication. For example, individuals who have heart attacks are more prone to depression. Individuals who have pulmonary issues are more prone to depression. Different types of surgeries can create depression as well. And so that's why I say inducing depression, because the person might not necessarily have been depressed, but these conditions that are pressed upon them. Now think about the chart of how all of this flows. The interaction goes back and forth. And if the person doesn't have a strong inner core, then there's a problem of how they're going to be able to manage the situation. So let's take a quick look at situational depressions, stress response syndrome. These particular areas like death, loss of relationship, divorce, loss of job, move, job responsibility change, health changes, loss of identity, retirement, any life change at all, were thought to be quite significant but only as a stress response syndrome. It wasn't to be seen over a period of a life of months. It can be months, but it gets worked through so that by the time of 12 to 24 months, the resolution can occur quite well. But as we notice, a lot of these items have to do what we've experienced during COVID. We've experienced loss of job. We've experienced loss of relationships. We've experienced death. We've experienced health changes. Our identity as we know it no longer is fit with a job title that you have that may now be gone. And so you're working from home or you're looking for a job. And you're trying to do whatever to make ends meet because finances are critical. Those are situational issues. But with the pandemic, those situational issues continued for a year and a half plus, and they still continue. I'm the one up here without a mask. Everyone I look to down there have masks. I mean, I'm not going to get into the mask controversy because there is a big controversy about masks. But the issue is, when would you ever have thought that you would be sitting in this church with a mask? You may have seen them in other countries. You may have seen people going about life sometimes in our own state with masks, but it was always because maybe there was an illness, maybe there was a disease, maybe they were concerned about issues of environment. Maybe that environment was not too healthy for them. Yet now, masks are seen as a way of trying to prevent COVID from spreading. And so what do? As it stretches more and more, we feel more and more depressed. We have fewer and fewer outlets. It's almost as if the moment of despair gets stretched out for a long period of time. A little bit of glimmer of hope may come, a little bit of resiliency by doing something different in your life. You may feel a little better, but then the cycle drops back in again. More despair. You know, it reminds me of Kubler-Ross, who did the whole study on grieving back in the 60s and 70s. She was a psychiatrist in Chicago, where a group of theological students from the seminary in Chicago went to her and said, "We would like to study people who are dying. What is it that we can help them with? What is their spiritual life condition? What is it that goes on?" And to her surprise, she went to the hospital, and the hospital administration said, "We have nobody that dies here." Well, it's kind of a strange event. Do you have a morgue downstairs? Yes. Well, what is that used for? Well, people die. Well, but you said nobody dies. Because the Hippocratic Oath says we preserve life to the fullest and do not allow people to die. And it was really a conundrum for them. In those early days in the 60s, 60 years ago, it was a real dilemma until she finally explored. And as she explored, she brought the students with her and found people who were dying in the regular medical wards, mixed in between all the other patients because they did not want them to feel isolated or have a sense of despair for themselves, knowing that they weren't going to live. But they were there. And she came up with this whole cycle, that if someone passes, you have shock, immediate shock. There's a sense of anger. You're angry at the docs. You're angry at this situation. You're angry because you didn't do something. Angry at yourself because you could have done more. And you've gone through these things in COVID even. And then you go through a little bit more, and then there's a little bit of understanding of what's going on. And you get a perspective, and you get a little objective Rectify the situation and say, now I understand what's going on there. So you take a step back. And then as you go further, there's a full understanding of then acceptance. I understand and I accept this, what happened. But lo and behold, this is not a one and done deal. This pattern, this history, this dynamic rolls on time and time again. It repeats itself. It's never one and done. So in COVID, it's the same thing. We're always repeating the situation over and over again. So what are some of the interventions? We look at friends and strangers that we can talk with, and even then sometimes we're told we can't because we have to isolate, we have to quarantine. Exercise and nutrition, that's something we can do on our own, which is very important. You keep the endorphins going, you keep the serotonin going. All of those are critical amino acids in your body that need to have continued formulation so that you find some relief. Talk therapy, psychotherapy, you can have CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, which are specific focused around a particular problem, or DBT, which is dialectical behavioral therapy, which is sorting out the distorted thoughts of how you get to what you do and why it happens. Those are good techniques of doing it. And then there are some medications. There's the Tricyclic Antidepressants, which is an earlier phase of an antidepressant. Then everybody knows an SSRI. That's the famous letters, SSRI. Are you on an SSRI? Well, yeah, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And basically what that does is it increases the serotonin level so that you finally get some relief from the distress of what you're experiencing with these stressors. Now, if some of you don't like medicines in the sense of contrived formulated medicines, there are two herbal medicines, but they're over the counter. Two herbal purchases that you can get. One is St. John's wort, and the other is SAMe. Now, both of these do not work with major clinical depression, unfortunately. But they do work with situational stress response syndromes, where you can take it according to as it's described, both St. John's wort and SAMe, for some relief. And I've seen people get some good relief from that because their body was in this more stress, short-term response. On the more major clinical depressive side, they don't work as well. The pharmaceuticals were so afraid of these two herbs as they were composited together for relief. They actually took them and studied them. And they have comparative studies that show their medication opposed to these particular herbs. And they're not far off, actually, with the more lesser situations. They have relief. They show that they are efficacious in their situation. Okay, let's go on to major clinical depression. That's the biggie. Approximately 16.2 million US adults suffer from major clinical depression per year. That equals approximately 6.7% of the US population. These are NIMH figures. And the MIT study said approximately 17% of the US population will experience a major clinical episode in their lifetime. Now, these are not exactly small numbers when you think that we have, 200, 300 million people in the country. That could be a significant number. And so we want to recognize that clinical depression is certainly a reason and a thing to be dealt with. However, the causes of significant clinical depression is never clear. That's one of the difficulties. The difficulties of the field has been always the sense of trial and error. Let's get a feel for what this is. Let's see what the history is. Let's see what the genetics are. And let's try to put together a composite to what this person may be experiencing. So there are 4 particular theoretical causes to a major clinical depression. These are all been kind of collated together from different sources. The first one on genetics is the Stanford study, which found that around 50% of the individuals that were studied with depression usually continue with depression in the family history line. So 1 out of 2, if there's depression, 1 out of 2 individuals will have depression. Of course, what is fairly significant is that 2 children or 2 adults may be in the same house. One may end up with depression, one may not. And so there is a different genetic code that each of us has that makes us suspect to the depressive episode. So I'll never forget when back in the 70s, there was a new theory that was purported about schizophrenia. And it was called the schizophrenic family. Schizophrenic family. Fancy name, until I started studying and talking with them. What is that about? What is the schizophrenic family? Well, you know, this is when the family is very enmeshed. Everybody knows each other's business. There's no clarity of boundaries. I said, wait a second. You're describing an Italian family. How can that be? I grew up in that. I don't understand what you're talking about. But the reality is that it was then debunked as not being able to be classified as such, and the theory went its own way. But the genetic issue is a very strong one. Schizophrenia was studied early in the Netherlands back in the 50s because of the records, the medical records that they keep are all codified, and they were able to see that in the medical records that schizophrenia actually had a genetic base to it. Substance abuse, comorbidity of alcohol and drugs often go hand in hand with major clinical depression. 30% of the 17% of the population of alcoholics and substance abusers are depressed. Alcohol and substance abuse may self-medicate to temporarily avoid pain and stress, but after use can crash. And then there's an experience of anxiety, irritability, increased bouts of low mood. And so when you begin to feel that again, it repeats the cycle. I need to get more stuff. I need to get more stuff, whether it's substance or alcohol, whatever. Got to keep going to keep the self-medication process going. Hard to break, but possible to break. Early childhood experiences include trauma, death of a loved one, physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, conflict in the family, hearing criticism, or having a parent who is depressed. All of these are potential causes for major clinical depression. And major life events that were under the situational depression, but you add that to adult as an unemployment, homelessness, chronic illnesses, chronic pain, abuse and unhealthy relationships, job-related stress. The length of the circumstance of 2 or more of these issues together can trigger a major depression. What are some of the symptoms of the major depression? Constant low mood, anhedonia, which is the inability to really feel pleasure in activities that you would think you would be pleasure fulfilling, but not. Loss of energy, feelings of guilt, worthlessness, everyday issues, indecisive issues with thinking, impaired concentration, insomnia, hypersomnia every day, restlessness, feeling slowed down, recurring thoughts of death and suicide. That's the more significant end of the major clinical depression. Now, it's fascinating. I found this study which talked about suicidal ideation. And I'm not quite sure how they did this, because how do you sit down with a person and say, how long do your thoughts about suicide last? That's a strange one. Well, they say they deliberate, those who feel suicidal thoughts, they deliberated about 24% or less than 5 minutes. 24% said they deliberated about 5 to 19 minutes, and 23% said 20 minutes to an hour. It's beyond me. In dealing with suicidal individuals, it's very difficult to understand the hurt and the pain that brings them to want to turn that on themselves. That's really what it's about. They can't withstand the pain any longer. And so they're thinking, I've got to find a way out. And the only way I can do that is if I do myself in, I will no longer feel. And to get to that point, to understand what it is that they're struggling with, is rather significant. So what are some of the interventions? You have meditation and prayer, which is a critical one. You meditate, you pray, is a significant part of restoration of the emotion. That's me. I said that. Exercise and nutrition, physical exam by a physician. It would not be uncommon if there was a significant depression that I would have the individual go to his physician and have a full physical to see if there's any contributing factors that are physiological to the depression. When I was consulting in Geneva, Switzerland, I had a dear couple who came to me working for the UN. They came to me and said, would you be willing to see my wife, because she's having such large swings and irritations and difficult to deal with, and not feeling herself, never had this before in her life, and just not doing right. I said, well, okay, we'll try to set up a consultation, which we did, and got that worked out. And as I heard the story, something just wasn't adding up. How could this person, who up to a certain point, she was in her late 40s, early 50s, had just gone through life without any incident, and suddenly around this time had come up with this very significant illness. And so as I talked with her, I said, something's not adding up here. I said, you've had a good life up to this point, and yet you go beyond this, and now everything is turned upside down. Have you had any surgeries lately? Have you had any mishaps that have gone on that have been trauma? I mean, we went through the whole list. And she says, oh, I did have surgery. Oh, I said, well, what kind of surgery did you have? She said, I had a partial hysterectomy. I said, oh, and what was the outcome? How did they put you forward after the surgery? Did they give you any supplements? Did you do all the usual questions? No, said I didn't need anything. It was fine. I was going to be fine, and then going on. But I noticed ever since that time, my emotions just seemed to be flailing all over the place. And I said, could you go back and talk to your surgeon and ask what actually went on in the surgery? And is there a possibility for some follow-up medications to help settle the emotions that seem to be totally out of hand? Seemed like a total hormonal shift. She came back and said, I can't believe it. I said, what's that? He did a complete hysterectomy and never told me. And here's this poor person struggling and struggling and struggling, needlessly. Could have been dealt with. Well, obviously, we got things turned around, and finally the right meds were put in place. She was able to settle down, and within a year, she was back to her resilient self. But these things happen. And it was amazing that in Switzerland that I would have found such an activity, but it happens. Now, what kind of medications can be used for major clinical depression? You see it there. SSRIs are used forever. Lexapro, I'll just give you the brand names. Lexapro, they treat depression, anxiety. Celexa, the same. Prozac, used for depression and for OCD. They found a very good study, well, several studies over the years with Prozac that was able to help a person who had OCD. And that was, that was significant OCD. We had repeated hand washing, continued repetitive actions back and forth as a way of trying to resolve the issue. Luvox treats OCD, but sometimes used for children at ages 8 and older. Paxil, Zoloft also helps for PMDD and PTSD, social anxiety panic disorder. Trintellix treats major depression, and Vibrad treats major depression and anxiety. Now, those are all the different types of tricyclics. Then you have Wellbutrin that's outside of the tricyclics that treats major depression. And it's interesting to note that Wellbutrin actually adds a boost of energy to the individual. It helps with the serotonin lift, Wellbutrin. It helps that individual with a little bit more. You know, as I was going through the list and sorting out all the meds, it reminded me in my training in my first year, I had a dear fellow who taught the psychopharm class. And we walked into the psychopharm class, and he went up to the board. In those days, it was still black with chalk. And he poured it up and said, there are 4 categories to deal with psychopharmacology. Anticonvulsants, anti-anxiety. They didn't call it an anxiolytic, but they just call it anti-anxiety. Depression, and seizure activity. Did I say that? Seizure. So what happened was 2 medications per area, and that was the extent of it. It was a breeze. You could only give 2 different types. As long as you understood what was going on, you could do whatever you wanted. I couldn't prescribe, but that's what they did. Now, under this Effexor, I need to let you know about Effexor, which is an SNRI. The original Effexor was stopped by Pfizer initially because it was taking too long to get to therapeutic levels. You had to take it 3 times a day, increase the amount of milligrams to be taken, and all the rest. This Effexor XR is a new brand which helps treat depression, anxiety, panic attacks, and social disorder. Okay, resiliency and hope. Here we are. We've been impacted. Our lives and others around us have been significantly disorganized, disengaged from many things that were a part of our life. We've been in quarantine for months. Physical, social distancing. I like the idea of physical distancing rather than saying it's social distancing. Because physical distancing is the 6-foot apart deal. Social distancing merely means that you don't have any contact with anybody. That's more devastating. There's no sense of hope in that process. Change in work, expectation and function, homeschooling, juggling between spouses for home responsibility, changes in the usual life schedule, chaos, as it may sometimes feel. feelings of fear, anger, sadness, worry, and frustration. Yet, we made the necessary changes and adjustments. We did it. For children who were kept from friends and families, school, sports, music lessons, having difficulty concentrating, having to be online, doing schoolwork, yet the necessary changes and adjustments were made. We find ourselves with lack of freedom and decision-making due to having to consider major restrictions just to go shopping, accomplish home projects, visit our senior friends, stand in line 6 feet apart with a mask. And these are my comments. Straining to hear what the other person is saying because you are not able to understand a word from behind the mask. It's weird. How many times does the person pulls the mask down to try to talk and then puts it back up? No, the idea is when you talk, you're supposed to have the mask there because that's when the expression of potential COVID happens. But that's what happens because you can't understand. You can't understand what's going on. Changes in the way our health needs are dealt with. As I said, telehealth is now going on. And also to be able to teach individuals how to deal with this technology. All new, particularly those who are older. Younger, I mean, this is like, let's do it. I'm all for it. But it's the older individuals who have difficulty trying to figure out the minefield of all of this technology. Yet, we made the necessary changes and adjustments. I read you an article from New York Times. We have all hit a wall. This is from an individual that's talking about, "Good morning to everyone," she tweeted recently, but especially to the sentence I just rewrote for the 10th time. "I feel I'm in quicksand," she explained by phone from California, where she has been under quasi-house arrest for the last year. "I'm just so exhausted all the time. I'm doing much less than I normally do. I'm not traveling. I'm not entertaining. I'm just sitting in front of my computer, but I'm accomplishing way less. It's like a whole new math. I have more and more fewer obligations, yet I'm getting so much less done." Sometimes we feel that way, isn't it? Huh? We're there. This is an article out of the Los Angeles Times, which I found rather intriguing. And I won't go into politics, but California, as you know, has had its own rules and regulations of how to deal with COVID. And the title of the article starts off by saying, "Feeling unsettled, anxious? Maybe you have COVID-19 vaccine envy." I said, envy? Well, I guess there's a bit of comparison that's out there. Who got the vaccine first? How did you get it before me? Did you have a special relationship with someone that got you the vaccine? What exactly took place? What's happened? I mean, it is totally out of hand. If you read this article, it is rather fascinating. Now, what about coping and going through? I'll just read these very quickly in terms of the COVID coping, because I want to get some question and answers going that we can do for this. Practical ways. I'll just talk about practical ways. Meditate, pray, read faith-based materials that are positive and uplifting. Take breaks from watching, reading, or listening to news stories, including those on social media. It is good to be informed, but constantly hearing about the same thing over and over and over again is very upsetting. Take care of your body. Balanced meals, regular exercise, plenty of sleep. Unfortunately, this situation makes you want to sleep all the time. So you want to take and make sure you get good sleep. Avoid excessive alcohol, tobacco, and substance abuse. Take time to unwind. We are in a perfect situation. Walk the beach, regular exercise, You can do many good things about going to a new location during your time off. Connect with others remotely to talk about your concerns and share feelings. And I'm not talking about texting. You want to hear the other person's voice. Talk. When my kids were growing up, they said, oh, I talked to so-and-so. Oh, really? What do they say? Oh, no, I text them. That's how we talk. No, talk by hearing the voice, being able to empathize where that person's at, where they're able to empathize where you're at. That's the important thing. And connect with your faith-based community. Very important. I was sent this email from one of my alma maters, which talked about looking back and looking forward. Cause for hope. And I just quote this as the situation. 14 months into an unprecedented worldwide pandemic, we now find ourselves on the precipice of hope. Thanks to the miracle of science and increases in production and distribution, the U.S. is now averaging more than 3 million vaccinations a day. Now, I knew that I wasn't very comfortable with what they said in that second line. Finding ourselves on the precipice of hope. When you think of a precipice, is that exciting? I don't know who wrote that. I mean, precipice to me means, look out, you're going to go off the edge. Doesn't sound very hopeful, but it goes on, because this is what it says. That's why it's stated that way. Yet, many hurdles remain, a race against the fourth wave driven by variants, a fight to overcome vaccine information and resistance, enduring inequities in both vaccine access and disease treatment, a long overdue testing strategy that's still in its nascent stages, on and on. I mean, is that hope? I mean, I can see where in one way you know what you have to deal with, so that's hopeful. But it's not producing hope. It's saying, we've got a long way to go here. When is this going to be over? Help. We need to bring this to a stop. And that's what I'm going to do right now. I'm stopping for Q&A. When the Q&A is over, I have one more slide that I want to share with you.
Thank you, Dr. Manganiello, and thank you all for joining us. At this point, we're going to transition to our question and answer session, including for those of you joining us online. So if you have a question and you're in the room, I'd invite you to come down to one of these podiums in the aisles where we'll have microphones set up and an opportunity to sanitize those between guests. So if you have a question, you can do that now. And if not, we do have a couple of questions from our online attendees already. And if you have other ones, please post those in the chat, and we have a volunteer, Alexa, who's going to read those questions for us so that Dr. Jim can respond to those. And as people kind of prepare and think about that, just a quick note, after this Q&A session, if you're joining us online, we're going to send everybody a follow-up email with some additional resources, particularly based on this question and answer time together. So Dr. Jim is going to put together some next step resources for things that people may be curious about, or if you're listening today and you think, oh, that's something that I'm struggling with, where do I turn next? He's going to help us out with that. So if you're watching online and you have not yet registered, or you're joining us in person and you hadn't yet registered, you can still do that so that you can make sure you get those follow-up resources. So I'm going to let Alexa come to the podium with our first online questions, and Dr. Jim, you can take it over.
Okay. Am I on still? Yeah, okay. If you don't mind, can I sit here? Yeah, go ahead.
This is loud. Our first question comes from Facebook, and it says, how do you help depressed children when you are suffering with depression yourself?
Okay, 1 second. I didn't catch all of that. Go ahead. I got to stand up. Go ahead.
Our first question comes from Facebook, and it says, how do you help depressed children when you are suffering from depression yourself?
Oh, that's an excellent question. Excellent question. First of all, you want to receive help from outside your family. If you're a mother of these children, You want to be able to receive some help for your children, to be able to get some, should I say, more neutral input. Because if you are depressed yourself, you're having a difficult time raising the children. You have your own emotions, your own irritability, your own short fuse of having to be resilient enough to deal with their behavior. And so consequently, you would want to be able to have an objective party who could help you in that process and talk with your children's needs to be able to free them up so that they don't fall into the same category of depression that you may have.
On kind of a similar trend, this is coming from Megan on Brushfire. She says, I'm very, very thankful for this. We moved from Florida to Cape over the summer. Between the move and the pandemic, I'm concerned about my son's mental health. Mine has also suffered, but I'm now seeing a therapist. I would love to hear how I can help my son cope with the challenges of being in a new place, uprooted from all of his friends, not really being able to make new ones. He's very social, and I know this has been extremely hard on him. Tomorrow is his first day of being in a classroom in over a year. He's 10 years old.
That's a tough one. When you uprooting children and they're missing their usual friends, there's a tremendous sense of loss in that process. And the reassurance that they can make new friends is not always helpful. We think it's helpful, but it's not always helpful because it puts more pressure on them to feel that somehow they have to comply and show parents or family that they're going to be doing it and doing it well and make friends, where they just may not have the capacity to have the energy to do that because they're still grieving the loss of their friends. So what you do is you try to have small interactive situations where you can invite a new person over, try to get them to know that person, or if they're on a Zoom teaching mode, are there particular students that they interact with more? Try to get that kind of situation. What it does is it calls for more of the parents' involvement, as it has for all of this over the year, to know exactly what's going on for your child.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions that you have?
Yes.
Oh, all right.
So kind of on the similar trend from Dory, she wrote, I'm curious about what might be suggested for toddlers ages 2.5 who have never really been with peers or in gatherings of multiple people, and conversely how they detach appropriately from parents or caregivers who they have not been apart from so
I
far.
don't understand a word of that question. Take your mask down. Take your mask down so I can hear you.
Absolutely. So I'm curious about what might be suggested for toddlers, like 2.5, who so far have not been with peers or in gatherings of multiple people, and conversely how they detach appropriately from parents and caregivers who they have not been apart from.
So they've been detached from people?
Not yet. Not
yet.
detached from caregivers yet.
Not the caretakers
Yeah.
or the parents.
Right.
And so they're very attached to them.
Very attached, probably.
Very attached. And so what you're going to experience is what we call social anxiety, of a child having to now navigate the big bad world of other children. And so that social anxiety is going to create more isolation, withdrawal, fear, reluctance to get engaged with others. And the important thing is you do it one-on-one, or you can do it in a smaller cluster of 3 or 4 kids, that you bring them together so you can have the separation anxiety and the social anxiety dealt with at the same time. So that way they can feel the comfort of both and no one's going to leave them. That's usually the fear.
Perfect. Thank you. I'll step back and
Okay.
read through some more online.
All right. Thank you.
I was captivated by your story of dealing with your cell phone And I was thinking about what advice you would give to somebody if they realize they need to see the medic, but he's not available for another week or two or three. What would be your top 1 or 2 recommendations for things to do in between when you realize you need the medic and when you actually get there?
I tell you, I'm having a terrible time understanding the question here. Pull your mask down a little bit so I can do that.
Sorry.
And then have that Clorox still done. Go ahead.
So in your story of getting your cell phone fixed,
Yes.
you had a wait before you could see the cell phone medic.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about someone realizing they need help, but it might be a week or 2 before they can see somebody.
Right.
What would the top 1 or 2 things be, your top 1 or 2 recommendations for things you can do while you're waiting?
While you're waiting for help. Yeah. Good question. I think that's a very good question, because I know that the attempts to reach out for help has been spotty and difficult, because I've heard stories where people have tried to get help and the person is booked out, the 3 months wait, 2 months wait, forever. That's one of the difficulties of this situation. In the meantime, the important thing is to understand what it is that you're actually feeling, because the more that you can understand the feeling and the thoughts that you're struggling with, the more that you can then make use of the help that you will eventually get to. That is, you want to start journaling. You can start journaling and journaling thoughts and ideas and emotion. So that way you're able to say, this is what I've been struggling with when that time finally comes. This has helped me at least to understand on my own some of what's happening, but I still can't sort it all out. Doesn't help. So that's number 1. Number 2 is you want to get a friend you trust, feel very comfortable with, and can talk with some of the struggle that you're experiencing. Now, it's interesting. When this whole field started to be looked at back in the late 50s, early 60s, Kharkov, who was at the University of Buffalo at the time, was very intrigued to know, how do we become empathic with people? How do we know that empathy is the key aspect of helping individuals get better? Because that's critical. And so he did a study with his own little 5-point Likert scale and did all these interviews with people. And what he found was that a professional trained psychotherapist was equally, if not worse, than a bartender. Now, that's not saying much, but that's back then. Because what it was is that it was the empathy and the concern and the communication and the talk and the follow-up of being able to say, how are you doing? What's happened? What's going on? You were able to talk openly with that person. And yet with a therapist, if they didn't have the right combination and skills that matched, it didn't go anywhere. Yeah. Okay. Another question. Oh, did you have a question back there? Okay.
Hi, I find you excellent. Are you taking new patients? Just kidding. I have been diagnosed schizoaffective, and they can't get my meds right. And I was just wondering, how important is physical exercise? Like, is it right up there with medication?
How good is Celexa?
No,
What?
physical exercise. Like, is it?
Physical exercise.
On a scale of importance.
Yeah, physical exercise is really important. One of the things that I would do for those who had situational depression, one of the very first things I would do is get a physical and then get into a significant exercise routine. Because that exercise will help endorphins and the serotonin levels to increase enough to give the person enough of relief of the depression. For example, if you have a runner, you have any runners in here that run?
It used to be, but what if you have depression.
What's that?
And it's major depression.
Major
It's
depression.
hard to go and exercise.
Are you saying that it is a resistive depression?
No, it's bipolar, so it's major depression.
Oh, okay. Let me be clear. Clinical major depression is different from bipolar depression.
I thought it was a swing on opposite ends.
Bipolar, no, this is all mixed in. Bipolar is a very specific kind of depression or mania. And you have the opposite of each one being available, right?
Right,
So you can either become manic or you can become depressed.
right.
And so the medication is hopefully trying to give a balance in between. Now, what happens with bipolar, the medication can make a person feel, when they get on medication, that they've lost all interest, they have no feeling of worth, you just can't feel motivated, you don't feel like you're going to do anything. Those are normal feelings initially for the first 3 or 4 months. But if you stay consistent with it, and then you continue to exercise, continue to do the things you need to do with your nutrition as well, all of that is important to be able to bring that level of balance better for you. Yeah, it's not an easy situation. It's a very complicated fine-tuning with bipolar.
Yeah, very fine.
Yeah, it is. No, it is. Because, see, with bipolar, they used to use lithium carbonate. And lithium was an old medication that was used in order to try to deal with the mania side, but didn't deal with the depressive side. And so that's why if you use lithium carbonate, the mania side comes down, and then you feel like you're all depressed. There's no value. If there are some other medications that can help with that process.
Yeah, that's why I asked about the exercise, because they just can't get the medication right. It's been years.
Well, it's better to nutrition and exercise are always in vogue.
Top priority.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. We'll take what, 1 more, 2 more? What do we got?
In realizing that meditation and prayer are primary, but coming across, especially young people, from 20 to 35, that do not have faith, what is the best way to deal with or to be empathetic, but guide them toward the reality of what is helpful?
Right. I think if you have a person who is not faith-based, the principles of faith are ubiquitous. They're universal if you look at it within the mental health field. It doesn't mean that you have to quote a particular scripture or a particular direction, but the basic element is there of how to conduct one's life, what is fulfilling, what are the beliefs that they have. Those beliefs can be very strong. And if you listen closely, there could be some faith-based element that you hear in them. And you can identify with them. I say, oh yeah, I heard that one time, that was important. And it's important to you. That's very critical. How can I help you with that? So you want to identify clearly where they are and to get them to bring it out more openly to you so that you know. I had one supervisor that had an analyst for a supervisor and said every week went back for supervision and laid out the situation. And the supervisor said, "You haven't listened enough." So what do you mean I haven't listened enough? These are the issues that are going on. No, you haven't heard what the person is telling you. The person is going to tell you what the issues are. Listen and respond. That's what the issue is here, okay? All right, one more.
All right, so from Facebook, it says, "It seems like getting help costs so much and it's so difficult to navigate. I've started down the path several times just to give up because of the barriers. And I'm already having difficulty feeling motivated. I feel totally overwhelmed by the thought and process of getting help. Do you have any advice?
Paying for therapy is expensive, no question. If they have insurance of any type, particularly the options base with Medicaid, those are accepted so that there is an opportunity to be able to get that accomplished. As long as the option plan stays intact and gets paid. If that's there, they're able to get help without any problem. One of the difficulties is that if you go to a Medicaid-based only payment, I hate to say this, I should be more kind, but it's not uncommon that they get clustered into the lower rungs of treatment and don't get the benefit of good treatment. That's one of the problems. I've seen it over and over again. Yeah, it's one of the things we have to fight against, really, in some ways.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Alexa. All right, I'm done. After this, what I'd like to show is one more slide that has helped me through the course of my last 12 years with my own physical conditions. And it's entitled Faithful to the End. I think I have it up here. And I'll read it because I think it has a great deal of meaning for us who are very much in faith. When I'm feeling afraid, full of uncertainty, when the plans that I've made all fall apart, when the future is unclear and all that I can do is wait, there is a promise echoing in my heart. He will be faithful to the end. He will provide time and time again. He will be faithful, so faithful to the end. He will be there when all else fades. His love is stronger than my pain. He will be faithful, so faithful to the end. There is mercy I cannot measure, mercy I don't deserve. There is forgiveness that's endless for me. Oh, what a blessed assurance to know how deeply I'm loved. I'll be reminded that's all I need. Blessings. Thank you for your attention tonight.
Thank you, everyone, for being here with us this evening, for all of you who joined us in person, and to everyone who joined us online. Just a reminder, we are going to send out a follow-up email, some additional resources, and if you asked a question online and we didn't have an opportunity to answer it, we are going to pass those on to Dr. Jim so that he can incorporate those into some of those next step resources. So please don't worry, we will follow up with you. And if you're joining us in person, typically we would treat you to some coffee and desserts, and we would spend some time together. We can't quite do that right now, and it's a little bit cold and rainy to spend that time on the patio, but we still want to give you something to take home with you, so there is a sweet treat for you on the welcome and connect desks on your way out. We ask that you take that with you as you go, because Jim didn't mention this, but I'm pretty sure that dessert, in particular cheesecake, is good for your mental health. So we hope you'll take advantage of that. So thank you, everybody, for joining us online and in person. This is the end of our talk, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Bye, everybody.